It's the Wilk Report. I'm Michael Wilk, coming to you from Cleveland, Ohio. With me today, as last time, is Tom Connors from Midnight's Edge. Welcome aboard, Tom.
Yep.
All right, so
Thank you for having me once again.
yeah, you're welcome. So just to our listeners, sorry for the lack of posting last week. I was dealing with a death in the family and just was not in the mood to try and do an episode for YouTube or do any writing. But so anyway,
Sorry to hear that.
yeah, it's my Aunt Mary that passed away. Yeah, she'd been sick for a while, but she's in a better place now. So anyway, I had opportunity to watch Hereditary, which is the horror movie written and directed by Ari Aster and starring Toni Collette and Gabriel Byrne. Now, I'm not going to give away too much of the plot because I don't want to spoil it for people who haven't seen it, which actually counts you, Tom, among that number. But I will say, though, that if you're looking for something with a happy ending or that pulls its punches, you're probably going to want to watch something else. But if you do have the stomach for a movie that breaks cinematic taboos the way this one does without flinching, then I recommend you go see it on the big screen before it goes out of the theaters, because you really need to do that, I think, to get the proper experience. Now, the story deals with the subjects of family secrets, family curses such as mental illness, a cycle of abuse and covering up that go with it. And they use the guise of witch cults and demonic possession to kind of tell this story. And it really doesn't let the audience off the hook in condemning the failure of families to address hereditary insanity. And, basically it's a warning that as long as we refuse to confront it and take action to get sufferers into effective treatment, then, the cycles just keep continuing. So, as horror movies go, I thought it was pretty good. There were a few weak spots in this story, but I thought, those were pretty minor, in my opinion. It handles the subject matter in a far more adult level than many might be comfortable with. And I was really impressed with the creepy performance turned in by Millie Shapiro, who plays the daughter Charlie. But, the movie got me thinking about the horror genre more generally and its place in film theory. And since I took it in film school, I saw a lot in Hereditary that really ought to be in other genres. But it's just kind of lacking. And by that I'm specifically calling out the brainless modern iterations of Star Trek and Star Wars.
Right.
Yeah. So but I've kind of been a horror fan since I was a kid, along with
Yeah.
its twin science fiction. And as a storytelling medium, especially for its ability to tell socio-political morality tales, it's to me it's like one of the perfect mediums to do that. So with my last video, Tom, you and I were talking about how much horror has been influenced by Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, and also how John Carpenter famously used the character of Michael Myers to replay Hitchcock's archetype of the emasculated male driven to slaughter young people, especially women, in an effort to reclaim his masculinity. There's a common theme running, from Psycho to Halloween to Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street, of the primal mother. So I was just kind of wondering if you wanted to say a few words on that, Tom.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's, of course, like yourself, I've been a horror fan since I could remember. And Psycho really was a turning point in horror, even though it wasn't the first movie exactly like it in so many ways. It was the most popular, and it reached through pop culture through all kinds of places that never had before, and influenced horror in ways it never had before. And it is probably single-handedly, I would say, responsible for the slasher genre as we know it. Which actually has kind of died out. And that's kind of where I come in, where you kind of brought up with Heredity before in the beginning. And one of the reasons why I haven't seen it yet is I'm not a huge fan of modern horror as much as I'd like to be. And B, I don't want to spend that kind of money on a horror movie when the prices for everything to go to see a movie are outrageous, unless it's something I know I'm really going to enjoy or have a good time with necessarily, or it's really going to be worth my time, which you have a very good argument for it. And it's something, if this show wouldn't have been, maybe a few days later, I might have actually gone to see it first, just so I had a point of view on it. So I really don't want to speak ill of or, in favor of it in any way of Heredity as itself. But speaking of is just modern horror overall, ever since we got into like the Saw phase and into the Paranormal Activity type phases now, and the Insidious phases, and it's
I know. I saw Insidious on DVD during a weekend Halloween movie marathon at a friend's house, and it was okay, but I didn't care for it, and it just kind of just took all these tropes, but it wasn't really inspired. It would just kind of replay what had been done before and better by other people. Right. But with Hereditary, I can pretty much alleviate whatever concerns you have. It's definitely worth the price of admission. I spent like maybe $8 something for the ticket because I went to the daytime showing. Because, speaking for myself, I don't like having to deal with a whole bunch of noisy crowds and at nighttime showings. So I tend to go mainly during the daytime, like first showing. That way, I've got the theater practically to myself. So that's another thing you might want to consider doing. Because also you'll end up paying less, and also I think at least with AMC cinemas. They've got like $4 movie day.
Tuesdays,
yeah,
something like that. Well, I do have Movie Pass. Don't get me wrong; it's not that. My problem is just the traveling distance and this, that, and the other. And with my son, usually I got to work out a babysitter and whatnot. And it's just a matter of logistics. And then once I get there, every experience that I generally have in a theater is horrible.
Yeah, I can certainly relate to that.
And like you said, it's nice when you can go and there's nobody else there, only a few other people, and you all are real courteous to each other, and nobody's bothering anybody. But when you go to see most movies around opening weekend or whatever, it's like, ugh. And I usually have to for the channel at Midnight's Edge, sometimes. So it's like, I gotta go through that. So if I don't absolutely have to, I'll generally avoid a movie until it comes to video. And anymore, it's like the window is so small and getting shorter all the time that it almost doesn't pay for me to waste my time dealing with all that crap for, and our reviews on our channel don't do so well compared to some of our other content. So it's like reviews are usually one of those things that are put on the back burner unless we're specifically going to do a roundtable. So, I mean, this is all, personal bullshit, and it's not.
Yeah, so and if I had the full version of Zoom, I'd be able to do a roundtable using that. Unfortunately, it's only the free version, so I can only do like one-on-one so far. But pardon my French on that, but yeah, like just the whole point, like I said, it's not just the going to the theater itself, and it's everything around it too. It's no, I can relate, but like I said, just to alleviate your concerns, I think it's definitely worth the trouble and expense to go see it, because it's nothing like Saw, it's nothing like Insidious or any of its imitators. It's actually owes a lot more, like I said, to Hitchcock's Psycho and also to Robin Hardy's The Wicker Man.
Right.
But just to kind of go back to some of the Hitchcockian influences, because I was talking about how John Carpenter had, pretty much made Halloween as an homage to Psycho, but also Friday the 13th was also an homage to Psycho. In fact, that was directed by Sean S. Cunningham, but he actually did a twist where he turned the concept of the primal mother dominating her offspring to the point of consuming him on its ear by reversing it. So, the trauma of losing a child consumes the mother, who then becomes the child in her own mind, so she can kind of both erase the tragedy and get revenge. And, interesting thing, and I know you were wanted to talk about this, so we're going to talk about it a little bit, but, so powerful that is this concept of the primal mother dominating is that Victor Miller, who co-created Friday the 13th, is battling out in court with Sean Cunningham over ownership, I think, of Pamela Voorhees. And so since you know a little bit more about that, can you go into that somewhat?
Right. Well, there's there's one side of the story and there's the other side of the story. The basic story, just to kind of give a little outline, is when Sean S. Cunningham saw Halloween, said, I want to do something like that, because at that time he was a low-level producer. He'd made a couple horror movies, I think, at least one anyway, with Last House on the Left, I think came out in 1974, but that was not your standard slasher film at that time. So that was around the same time as like Texas Chainsaw Massacre and stuff like that. Psycho, on the other hand, was a direct inspiration for John Carpenter's Halloween, which of course inspired Friday the 13th, as we said, because Sean saw that and said, I can do that. That's easy. Came up with a concept, gave it to Victor Miller. Victor Miller wrote the story. And I can't remember if he did it consciously or subconsciously, but as you said, Victor Miller basically took the idea of Psycho and flipped it on its head. So instead of the son being the psycho, it was the mother. And the mother being influenced by the son's crazy voice instead of the other way. You know, same kind of concept. And of course, now there's this lawsuit going on because the movie is well over 30 years old. And if that's the case, an original creator or writer has the option to go back and reclaim his copyright if he's the sole creator of said work. This is how James Cameron got the rights back to Terminator, for instance. I think if Wes Craven was still alive, he could do the same for like Nightmare on Elm Street, for instance. But point being, Victor's trying to use this law to get the rights back to the what would only be the original Friday the 13th, which I'm sure would only include the name, Mrs. Voorhees, a kid version of Jason, and the idea of the camp counselors being killed by the basically the entire idea, not to give away the entire film, but
the problem is you can't really copyright an idea. So, I mean, you can copyright the execution of that idea. I mean, that's why during the 90s,
right. But what he doesn't have
this conflict between Deep Space Nine and Paramount, and then J. Michael Straczynski with Babylon 5, and they were kind of battling out in court over the idea of a space station next to a stable wormhole, and then a big war happening. But they took such divergent paths, you can't really call them the same. So I always kind of thought that lawsuit was silly, but it kind of seems to me like we're taking similar conflict between Miller and Cunningham, where it's like, no, I had the idea, no, I did, and
right.
who's got actual
and that's
ownership.
The thing is, Cunningham's argument is that it was work for hire, and if that's the case, Sean would be the rightful owner of said property. If Victor Miller wins this case, the important part of this is he will not get Jason as he is famous. He will not get adult version of Jason with the hockey mask, because that version of Jason did not come in until Friday the 13th Part 2 and Part 3, respectively, as far as those copyrighted versions of that character. So, and as I know right now, that the rights to Jason reverted back to New Line Cinema, because back in 1994-ish, in there somewhere, maybe 93, 92, I can't remember offhand, which is funny because I just interviewed the director of Jason Goes to Hell, and I can't recall right offhand because I'm on the spot. But whenever that was, the New Line had bought the rights to Jason, not Friday the 13th, just Jason. So all they could use was Jason. That's why we had Jason Goes to Hell and Jason X and Freddy versus Jason. Well, then there was a couple years back, Paramount was making the Christopher Nolan film. What was it called? The space one, Interstellar. Yeah, that's the name of it, right?
I don't remember.
Yeah, Interstellar. And then, but basically, Warner Brothers wanted in on that. So, in some crossover deal between Friday the 13th, the South Park movie rights, and Interstellar, Warner Brothers and Paramount worked out a deal where Paramount actually got the rights to Jason back for 5 years. So, for 5 years, Paramount sat on not only the Friday the 13th rights, which they've always had, but the rights to Jason again. Because when they made the remake, they did a joint thing between New Line and Paramount, and Platinum Dunes, of course, produced it. So they were able to work it out to where they all had the rights and everything was done. And I think Paramount had foreign distribution and Warner Brothers had domestic, was the deal. And then now, though, Warner Brothers technically owns the rights to Jason. Once again, Friday the 13th and all that kind of stuff, as far as Mrs. Voorhees, the original films, up through 8 are all at Paramount again. But that's what Victor Miller is fighting for. Is he's saying he owns the rights to the first film, basically. And basically what I believe then what he would get, what I would assume was what he wants is the rights to the film itself, the first film only, obviously, and some kind of residuals from all over these years. But again, to bring it back around to what we were talking to, of course, Hitchcock not only influenced Halloween, as we said, which in turn influenced Friday the 13th, which in turn turned back around and influenced again by Psycho. Of course, it was there. And it carried all the way through into the 80s. Once again, when Halloween and Psycho and Friday the 13th and all these other films influenced Scream.
Yeah, yeah, and
Which
that brings us to Wes Craven, because Craven is another
right,
person who was influenced by Hitchcock. In fact, he famously took in the original Nightmare on Elm Street the Hitchcock tactic of killing off your protagonist partway through
right,
the movie, so that you're kind of left unbalanced and trying to figure out what the hell is going on, whom do I identify with, and that's actually something you can't do very often. I think maybe once in a generation, because it's very tricky to unsettle the audience like that, because they invest this time and energy, of emotion into the character, and then suddenly that character is removed from the board, and now you have to try and invest into another character. Oh, remove that character from the board. Okay, so where are we? So it's very tricky and delicate balance to kind of reach with that, but Craven pulled it off.
yeah.
But
Craven was like a modern day Hitchcock. Well, he's of course passed away now, and I wouldn't call him modern day now, but as of through
for his time and generation, he was
he was the modern day Hitchcock, definitely. He held the mantle as far as I'm concerned. I love all these great horror directors like John Carpenter and all those guys, but Wes Craven was the top as far as pound for pound. Even some of his goofier movies, like you said, he knew how to handle characters and structure, and you could definitely tell he had tons of Hitchcockian influence on top of other influences, which of course made him so much different than the rest.
Yeah, and it's I think it's a testament to Hitchcock's genius that so many of these guys are look up to him, as being a master of manipulating the audience and possessing a tremendous understanding of the human psyche. And that's where we come back to Hereditary, because it's no different in knowing its story's concepts to Hitchcock's use of the primal mother to frighten audiences, because it's really through the matrilineal side of the movie's family that the evil is passed on, and it's the ever-present domination of the family matriarch, even in death, that drives the action. There's even a character in there named Joni, who's a friend of the late mother who had passed away, who as the movie progresses, takes a more controlling participation in events. So, and to the extent that the male characters factor into the story, it's as victims. They're dominated, being controlled, and ultimately consumed by the women. So, but there's another influence in there in Hereditary, and that's Robin Hardy's 1973 masterpiece, The Wicker Man, because there's a lot of misdirection in there, but to the point, and if you've seen the Wicker Man, you'll probably see the ending coming a mile away. But I think that's kind of like maybe the only major weak spot in Astor's narrative. But it's not something I can really blame him for, because it still works. But once you find out who the real victim is, and how is this going to resolve itself? But yeah, there's a touch of Hardy in there for sure. But the larger point is that there's this concept of powerful women emasculating weaker males, and especially as it pertains to The Wicker Man. I don't know how long it's been since you've seen that film, but Edward Woodward's...
I vaguely remember seeing the original when I was younger, and I have not seen the Nicolas Cage version, but I've seen the ending.
Yeah, you haven't missed anything seeing the Nicolas Cage version, but in the original, though, there's a scene where Edward Woodward's Sergeant Neil Howie is tempted by Britt Eklund's Willow McGregor, because she does the seductive nighttime dance that really kind of tempts Howie to try and have sex with her, and he's got this fear of women that and sex as being evil and only done within the confines of marriage, which, if it's so evil, why save it for marriage? But that's an interesting contradiction. But there's the whole episode, it leaves him kind of frustrated and impotent to deal with his own urges, which he's constantly suppressing, and it's that very suppression that's born of this fear of women and masked in kind of like pseudo-Christian righteousness that ultimately dooms him, because someone who's not scared of women might have given in to his urges and saved himself from becoming the sacrificial victim, but he's unwilling to face this fear and his urges as being normal and healthy, and so that's what leads to the ending happening. But
basically
so there's pattern in these films, and they're Descendants is one in which women have, far more power over men, for good or for ill, than I think a lot of people are really comfortable with. And so when you come to the slasher subgenre of horror, the only way for the male killers to reassert their masculinity is to lash out in violence. So they're compelled to kill or dominate in their own twisted manner because they're unable to cope with the control women have over their lives.
Right. And what you basically are explaining is one of Hitchcock's, like, I guess you would call it his core rules or elements. And that is basically taking something that obviously somebody has the biggest fear of and having them face it. And basically we get to see how they face it. Look at like Vertigo, perfect example, stuff like that. It's like, it's always uncomfortable to see a character, especially somebody we care about, be put in a position we know that they're uncomfortable with. And that's one thing Hitchcock was amazing at. He created basically all the tropes that we see in up to this day in television and movies. And sure, he borrowed a lot of them from other places. Don't get me wrong. I'm not going to take credit or not take the credit away for him from, like, he borrowed from French directors and I'm sure other places like that and stuff like that. It's just a matter of how he did it.
Yeah, for people who haven't taken film history or film theory, pretty much everyone rips something off from someone else. It's just how they filter it through their own minds to find it, their own voice, and that's what's really original, according to Geddy Lee from Rush. If you go with his description of what makes something original,
right?
But you were saying.
Well, no, that's just it. It's like I mean, you ran to this point where there isn't anything that's real original anymore. And it's interesting when going back to Heredity, though, you said it's like somebody kind of harkened back to this, this idea that originally started with Psycho, which actually was a book before Hitchcock made it into a film. And the book is quite different than the movie. I mean, it has some similarities, but in a lot of respects,
a lot of that was inspired by Ed Gein, who was a serial killer who tried to become his own mother. So that, so that's basically.
Which, of course, I come from the same place he does. Not the same town, but same state. So it's like, he's pretty popular around here. So frankly, it's one of those things where it's like everything. Of course, life inspires things all the time and whatnot, but it's like you said, it's how the artist chooses to use the paint. When they decide to, of course, every artist since the beginning of time has used blue, but Hitchcock could use blue in a way you've never seen before. And a lot of the artists that he influenced beyond that were able to do the same kind of thing. And, Wes Craven and even Sean Cunningham to a point, I guess. And of course, John Carpenter and all these other great directors. And I'm glad to hear that a movie like Heredity, and you're not the first person to tell me this. So, I mean, it does speak for the film, and it's come from some very...
Yeah, and I'll tell you this: the Wikipedia entry on it doesn't do it justice, because that there's things in there that just are not done in cinema. In fact, spoiler alert: there's a strong pattern of beheadings in the movie, but and that actually kind of brings me a memory back of Tim Burton's Sleepy Hollow back in 1999. Because there's this taboo in cinema that you never ever show children coming to any real harm, and even when Tim Burton did Sleepy Hollow, there's a scene where a family is killed, including their small child, but you never actually see it happen. You see the Headless Horseman come after the kid and grab him from under the floorboards, and then you cut to him putting something in a bag, presumably the kid's head, but you never actually see it. I think that got a little more taboo in
the 80s, because there's a lot of 70s movies with kids dying all the time.
Yeah, but a lot of the times you never actually see it happen.
Right.
Which,
true to a point.
Yeah,
but,
so it's implied, but as long as you don't show it, you're kind of sort of off the hook. But that taboo is basically broken in this one. If you're squeamish for that kind of thing, that's something you definitely want to avoid. But it just kind of goes to show that when it comes to horror and slasher movies, and I think cinema in general, I think there's something kind of lost in the seemingly endless array of reboots and reimaginings. I mean, none of the reboots really seem to capture the spirit of the originals, and a lot of them are just kind of like shallow and empty shells of the stories that were told far better, and which much more informed inspiration by writers and directors who have greater understanding both of cinematic language and human psychology. Because for all we're supposed to believe that STD and Disney Star Wars are promoting strong women, they're really not, because the female concepts have nothing beneath the pretty skins of the actresses portraying them, and those concepts are poorly written, poorly executed. They make goofball mistakes that really kind of belie their supposed strength, and they're so incompetent and unsympathetic, you can't believe that proclaimed strength, because they keep telling us they're strong women, but we never actually see it. But you look at a movie like Hereditary, for example, or another movie from the early 2000s called The Abandoned, which is another ghost story, which, if you haven't seen that one, I've got that on DVD, but it's about this woman who goes to visit her ancestral home in Russia after she's informed that she's inherited the house from her late father. And that actually kind of takes a primal mother concept and flips it to the opposite gender, where it's the father dominating even beyond the grave. So if you're in the mood for a scary movie, that's another one I would recommend. But
right,
but you don't actually really see a whole lot of this stuff going on in a lot of cinema today, more generally. And with movies like Insidious or Saw, it just kind of takes its formula and just repeats it ad infinitum, to a greater extent than we saw even in the 80s with Friday the 13th and Halloween and Nightmare on Elm Street franchises, because those were kind of guilty of the same thing, just not on the same level as Saw or Insidious.
Right. Well, I think the first film doesn't get as much credit as it probably should in a lot of ways. Because if you stop and think about it, Mrs. Voorhees, as over the top as the character kind of comes off with the portrayal, she's still a pretty strong female character, despite the fact that she's completely nuts.
Yeah, because this is a woman who's lost her child to other people's neglect, and she's determined to get her revenge, and nothing is going to stand in her way. Because you killed Mama's offspring.
Yeah,
she's not going to forgive you for that.
5 minutes with her on FaceTime?
Yeah,
and with that 5 minutes has stuck with us now for almost 40 years.
Yeah, it's because it was well executed and well written by people who understood, just how powerful maternal instinct is. And that seems to be a running theme in a lot of horror movies, especially stuff that's based on Hitchcock's Psycho, is this concept of the primal mother who's so strong that because basically Halloween was unstoppable force versus a immovable object, game of chicken, basically, who's going to swerve first. And Laurie Strode is the primal mother, the immovable object, to Michael Myers' unstoppable force. And
right.
and we learned he actually is quite stoppable under the right circumstances. And so we're getting that another entry in Halloween coming up in October. So that's kind of going back to what we were talking about last time. So it just really shows that that concept is still so powerful that you can return to it 40 years later and people still remember it. But 5 years from now, who's going to remember Insidious? Or who's going to remember Star Trek STD?
Right. Well, yeah, that's just it. And I mean, even Andre from Midnight's Edge will be the first to point out, the only cinematic universe right now that's basically a hit other than the MCU is the Conjuring universe.
Yeah,
which is really kind of strange, and that's probably like one of the leaders right now as far as the horror films go. But that's kind of where we went with the horror genre. I really hope Halloween opens it back up again, because it seems like we've really gotten in this very narrow, dark. I don't mind the gothic dark horror films, but I like a variety to a point, and I miss the good old slasher films to a point. But they're no fun anymore because everything's done, with CGI and not practical effects anymore.
Yeah, and that's my
gripe
about,
just so generic. And
yeah, that's my gripe because about today's so-called writer and directors, because they've only learned the technical aspects of movie making without learning any of the deeper storytelling taught in film theory and film history. And it really takes more original projects by people such as Ari Aster to tell the kind of horror-driven morality tales that society, I think, really needs at this point in time. Because blockbuster adventures, oversaturating movie theaters, I don't think they're up to the job. At least not on the adult level that Hereditary and other movies like it can do, because for all the social and political subtext in, for example, Black Panther, which I actually liked a great deal, it had things in there I thought were pretty worthy, but it can't even begin to compete with a movie like Hereditary, which has a far lower budget, because you've got tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars going into it, and that kind of really harms creativity because all that money being spent, it kind of requires movie makers to kind of dumb it down and kind of ignore the deeper meanings in the message that they're trying to convey. And there's too much pressure from corporate to go for the cheap thrills and the laundry list checkpoints, because something that actually makes people think about the subject matter within the story is considered too risky given the amount of money being spent. So the thinking from the suits at the studios is take the safer path. And in my opinion, the problem with this risk aversion is that it provides increasingly hit or miss results, and as we're seeing with Star Wars, it's missing more than it's hitting. But I think the beauty of having a lower budget horror story is that the risk might be higher, but so is the rewards at the box office if it scores a home run. Because Halloween, I think, was made for something like $320,000, but it pulled in $70 million worldwide at the box office, which is far in excess of what was spent to make and market the movie. So suppose Marvel or Lucasfilm were forced to make smaller films that focus on character and storytelling, and focus less on the stunts and the CGI. How might they be improved if you have to focus more on story and character?
Well, and that's just it. You've got different kinds of films, and I totally get where you're coming from, and at the same time able to was able to how do I put this? It was able to, like you said, interject a lot of social commentary, but at the same time reach a large demographic of people because it was a Marvel film and it was made in a way that, could reach a broader audience than the typical like horror film that we're talking about, on the other hand, would. And that's where, obviously, out of necessity, they can't spend $100 million on a movie like Hereditary. I'm sure a lot of studios would love to do something like that and let a director go out and have fun with something like that, but it's just not feasible because you never know when a movie's gonna hit like that. Because I'm sure back in the day, Miramax or whatever Dimension would have spent a hell of a lot more money on the first Scream movie if they knew it was going to be as big of a hit as it was, but they didn't know. They knew it was going to do okay, but they spent with you try to spend within your budget of what you can make, and that's just it. It's when you're going to make $100 million movie, it has to be able to make 300 million better or more back at the box office, or it's a total wash for the studio. And that's where these politics come in of we have to hit certain demographics. You can't have this kind of swearing. You can't have nudity. You can't have this. You can't have that. It's got to be a PG-13. And, sure, it's going to handcuff certain directors, but a good director will take any kind of confine or constriction, if that's the right word, and use it in a way that helps their art. A good director will. One movie I always keep jumping back to is Jaws. And that's because Steven Spielberg had nothing to work with on that film.
Yeah,
and he made it work.
Especially a shark that didn't work most of the time.
Exactly.
Right,
literally nothing works.
Yeah, and I think Liz over at the website And You Call Yourself a Scientist was asking the question, what had happened if the shark had actually worked? How different a movie might Jaws have been. I don't think
we'd have... Jaws would have become something like Piranha or, one of its B-movie... one of the B movies that it had inspired. I don't think we'd be talking about it to this day as much. Spielberg may not have even been that big of a director to this day. He might just be a schlock director to this day if Jaws had turned out the way it was originally planned, if you think about it.
Yeah.
Because if that shark was so going to be in the movie that much, it'd have been just like one of those cheesy B. Corman movies.
Yeah. And, it's interesting because Sean Carlin, who's a screenwriter turned novelist, in the comment section on my blog about this subject, was pointing out, even the original Star Wars, was a comparatively low budget, idiosyncratic passion project. It was, pretty risky film for an inexperienced director to take on before Hollywood transformed it into, fast food. And Superman the movie also, had I don't want to say it had a relatively low budget. It actually went over budget, which is one reason why Richard Donner got pulled from the production on Superman 2. But still, though, if you look at that and compare it to Man of Steel, for example, there's a lot more story and character in Richard Donner's film than there is in Man of Steel.
Well, because they had to rely on that more so.
Yeah, and he didn't have like hundreds of millions of dollars to spend on CGI that was unconvincing and half-assed because they were rushing to get it out on time. I mean, yeah, you want to get it done on time and under budget, but some things you got to really slow down and do it right the first time, because otherwise it's going to go south. And to me, it's like I would rather have a movie like Richard Donner's Superman or George Lucas's original Star Wars or Carpenter's original Assault on Precinct 13 than any of their modern iterations.
Right. Well, and that's just it, because there's just something about them that they don't have the same. You can only hear the Beatles once.
Yeah.
The first time, I mean. It's like you hear them the first time, and it's the first time you hear something it's you see it again, and somebody tries to, it doesn't matter how much you polish it, how much money you throw at it, it's still not going to be any better than it was the first time, no matter how hard you try. Very rarely has a remake or reboot or reimagining ever gone above and beyond what the original film does. And that hasn't happened in so long because the imagination isn't there anymore, in a sense that, yeah, you can imagine anything you want. I can imagine a unicorn, in a movie, and it's there. I can have it, right away on a computer. They didn't have that back then. And to me, I feel that brought out the inspiration a lot more than they do now, because that's where you run into guys like Rian Johnson and Zack Snyder, because they don't have to be told no.
Yeah, and I think if you told more directors no and said, no, you really have this much money to spend, so you better spend it wisely. Because
right.
I think if you have fewer resources, a lower budget, you're going to have to get more creative with what you have to work with. And that's a large part, I think, of why so many of these movies that are 40, 50 years old and still around and still inspiring people today work so well, is because they didn't have all those resources, so they had to be that creative. And so I think
right.
Like I said, I think one of the things that could help with superhero movies in general, not because even though Marvel is pretty popular, but it's the movies still have their share of problems. And I think especially Black Panther, as much as I love that, but the CGI at especially the third act was horrible. So it's like, guys, this is what happens when you have too much money to spend. Scale it back, focus more on the story, and let the audience decide if it's worth it or not. Because you never know what you're going to have, until you actually put it out there. But if you spent so much time and money on all this fluff, that really is just Robin Williams described it as all this wonderful icing on the cake. But if the cake is made of shit, well, no one's going to care about the icing.
Right. And I've used that analogy in a lot of different ways too. And granted, I love Marvel. I think they have their formula figured out pretty well, but just like any formula, it's formalic in certain ways. Even though each film is its own kind of thing, I don't deny that Marvel is part of the McDonaldization or the fast food ization, for a lot, because there's no real word for it, of
the fast fooding of movies.
Yeah, of movies, basically. And even though they're the best of the best, sure, they're the higher end. They've been able to figure out the formula, and it works.
Maybe the best of the worst would be a better analogy, because I guess
well, you could in a way, but they've been able to take it, and you have to run something like the Marvel Universe like a television show. See, that's the thing. Sometimes people think it's such a bad thing to look at something like Marvel and go, yeah, Kevin Feige runs that. It's up to him. It was because of him, that Edgar Wright didn't get to make his Ant-Man movie. But Edgar Wright had 8 years to make his Ant-Man movie. And half of it was his fault for for not getting there. Something else was always more important for Edgar. So obviously, I don't think Edgar was that invested in it as he, likes to claim. At the same time, Kevin Feige had to do what was best for his Marvel Universe at that time. Now, I bet you $5 if, Edgar had made the movie closer to the original Hulk and Iron Man film, he probably would have gotten the movie he wanted. Because at that point, Feige wasn't able to, control this as he does now, because he had Perlmutter and other people involved. But now he's been able to take the reins completely, and that's what you need when it comes to a franchise like that. Something like Hereditary, though, is a movie that is all about the director's voice, and that gets us back to guys like John Carpenter and Wes Craven and so on and so forth. Because, you know, a movie like that, even without seeing it, I can tell you right now, it wouldn't, $100 million wouldn't have made that movie any better. I guarantee it. If anything, it made it worse.
Yeah,
I bet.
Yeah, and and it's just like I said, it's really amazing, you know, because a film like Hereditary, you know, that's basically, you know, a great example of auteur theory, where, you know, you're seeing the voice of the director, who also in this instance wrote it. Not every director actually writes his own film. In fact, yeah, because Hitchcock never actually wrote Psycho. You know, he loved
less
taking
nowadays. I mean, sure, directors will contribute, but yeah, you don't have a lot of the writer directors like Wes Craven and stuff like that nowadays. And like you said, even Hitchcock didn't write his own stuff.
Yeah. So, but yeah, in fact, I remember a story about John Huston, who was looking to do The Maltese Falcon. He wanted to film the book, and there had been a couple of iterations of it previously. One had been a slapstick comedy. The other was kind of like this film noir, but it really wasn't done all that well. But, you know, none of them really filmed the book. It was more like loose adaptation, but Huston wanted to actually film what was in the book. And it was his secretary, I think, who left a copy of the screenplay on his desk, and he went with that. And, you know, the rest, as I say, was history. But, you know, so you never know, because there's a lot of writers out there who are just waiting to get discovered, but, you know, they're kind of getting supplanted by ass clowns like Ruin Johnson or Jar Jar Abrams or worse, Michael Bay. Because I don't think Michael Bay even works with an actual screenplay. I think he just has a checklist and there's no actual screenplay.
I don't know if he reads. I think he just looks at storyboards. Yeah,
probably. Yeah, it's like, oh, this doesn't have any pictures in it. Well, yeah, but yeah, what about the lines? Well, they can just improv. Look, it's a Michael Bay movie.
As long as he looks sexy, that's all that matters, right?
Yeah,
explosions,
explosions, sexy women, dick jokes, gay jokes. What more do you need?
Shia LaBeouf.
Actual cannibal Shia LaBeouf.
Yeah. But no, yeah, just to kind of get it back around to, you know, kind of the topic at hand, though. Yeah, it's we've reached this point where horror movies have joined the rest of them. The difference, and horror movies are kind of really comparable to like comic book movies and stuff like that, in the sense that they had their own built-in fans, and they're a very loyal bunch.
Yeah, they are. I don't think we would be seeing a Halloween film if there wasn't still a huge demand for it.
Oh no. And, you know, look at all these small companies that are sprouting up all the time because they just make mostly horror movies, low budget horror movies, because people who are horror fans will generally, especially the hardcore horror fans, you know, they will always give something a chance, no matter what it is. I've known some horror fans, you know, that will watch just about anything. You know, and
yeah, kind of like Hellraiser. Like the last couple of entries, I could think the guy who wrote and directed the last one actually went ahead and I don't know if it was you guys who interviewed him or someone else, but you know, he was talking about his troubles with Doug Bradley and everything, and it's like, man, I wish I could have seen that, because I had kind of fallen out of the Hellraiser franchise, because, you know, so many of it gone direct to video and I missed them. And because I had seen like the first 2 or 3 and, you know, just kind of stopped watching after part 4 because it was just awful. And then, so I just kind of stopped watching. And then I heard about this last one and I was like, damn, this kind of really takes it back to its roots, kind of.
Yeah, I'm kind of surprised on the latest film. I know it takes a lot of inspiration from other places. And yeah, we did. We talked to Gary Tunnicliffe, the writer and director. And there was a point where he was going to make the film a non-Hellraiser movie. Too, so it does speak to the quality, especially considering he had, what did he tell us?
Yeah, practically no budget at all. In fact,
like not even $300,000, I think it was.
Yeah, and then I think he did like I don't want to call it a fan film, but, you know, kind of like an independent in a way, short, where like I think it was like literally only a couple grand, and then that's kind of like where the pissing match with Doug Bradley started, because he was like, hey, why didn't you call me? It's like, well, I only had a budget of $2,000. I wouldn't have been able to pay you, so I didn't think you
right. And well, what happened was it got picked up by the DVD company or Miramax or whatever, saw it, Dimension saw it, and they're like, "Oh, that's amazing. We want to put it on the next movie." Because basically, the way places like Blumhouse, Dimension used to work back in the day. A lot of these smaller companies or bigger companies, even, they'll have just a whole treasure trove of these movies sitting on a shelf, and they just pick certain times that it works best for them to release them, like when, say, a said star gets huge, or it's just the right time for another sequel. Because like he said, they filmed a bunch of those like back to back to back to back, and then they would just release them as they seen fit. They had like 2 of them sitting on the shelf for years.
Yeah, and I think there was this movie with, and I forget the name of it. I'm having a brain fart, but it was like right about the time Scream came out, and then Dimension decided to release all these movies. And one was with Peter O'Toole and Liev Schreiber and a couple of others. But it's about this town where everyone's disappeared, or where they do find someone. It's a kind of like a mummified corpse or something, and it turns out like these spectral things are kind of like feeding on the townspeople, but and then, it's like it got to the point where like all the covers started looking the same. Even Halloween H20 and Resurrection, you look at the box cover and it's like exact same design as Scream, and it's like, guys, stop trying to imitate Scream.
That got really tiring, and I think that's one of the main reasons. Like, I don't hate Scream. I actually like the first Scream and the second and third and the fourth one. I thought they were all pretty decent. Andre, on the other hand, hates it. And I think I know why. And that's one of the reasons why, is because Scream just kind of took over the horror industry. Yeah. And that's what you have, is these phases and fads. And like right now we're in this like Insidious / Conjuring phase right now. And it was like the Paranormal Activities for a while. And it was the found footage for a while after Blair Witch. It all goes in phases. I'm just hoping Halloween will bring back the slasher genre again. And we got the Chucky series coming out, and
that's another one that another one that's interesting, because we were talking a little bit about that before we started recording. So how about we talk about that right now?
Right. Well, it was either late last year or earlier this year, Don Mancini, the man who basically created Child's Play and Chucky, had announced that they are going to do a sequel series. I can't remember if it was going to be on Hulu or Netflix or Sci-Fi, one of those. I can't remember offhand. Sadly, I don't have it in front of me. But anyway, it's coming out. It's like a limited series. Like, I think it's like going to be 8 episodes or something like that. But yeah, they've had like 6 movies now, I think it is, and 7 movies now. So then this is supposed to like run like another sequel. This is coming out this fall. Well, all of a sudden today, Collider, I guess, broke the story that MGM, who originally owned the rights to Child's Play and the first Child's Play film, and they do own the first Child's Play film, sold the rights to Universal years back. And I guess they finagled some deal where they're going to do a Child's Play reboot. Now, the way the report makes it sound is that it's probably going to more or less be a Child's Play reboot, mostly in name and concept only. Because I'm sure they did a video on it, but if you find the article, it explains that it's about some teenagers dealing with a doll that comes through some kind of computer game or something or other like that. So Collider doesn't even know if they have the right to use the name Chucky, which I don't think they will.
Yeah,
because it's my understanding the Universal owns all that. So yeah.
Yeah, and Lars Klevberg, who directed Polaroid, which hasn't been released yet. I guess Polaroid is going through some legal limbo because of the Weinstein Company being mired in legal situation. Which, it's like, Harvey, if you hadn't been a rapey son of a bitch, that wouldn't be happening. But yeah.
Well, it's not just him right now is the problem. Like, they've had like 2 or 3 people or 2 or 3 companies interested in buying the film, but like the first company couldn't get the funding together, and then like the second one's backed out, or vice versa, and then the latest company was like all on board to buy it, and then they had some scandal or something go down with it. It's like this film library is cursed or something.
Yeah, but fortunately someone at MGM saw Polaroid, and based on that, Klevberg got the job for the new Child's Play project. So
and it's also being produced by the producers for It. So I mean, it's gonna get some buzz around it. It's just strange. I highly doubt Mancini has anything to do with it, outside of maybe an executive producer name only because of the original creation of it. So frankly, I'm not sure how connected this is with the Child's Play franchise. So it kind of gives me a lot of pause, or I don't know about this. I don't like this kind of thing happening.
Yeah, and speaking of it, part 2 is already been cast. They've already done.
Unsurprisingly, we got most of them are pretty much the ones we figured they were going to be.
Yeah, and I keep thinking it's like, because I saw the original miniseries back in 1990, and I saw the first half of the new movie. There were some parts of it to like. There were some parts of it not to like. Again, as with the original miniseries, a lot got left out because it's too graphic. But it'll be interesting to see how the second one does, because the only thing that didn't sell me was their Pennywise. I don't think Bill Skarsgård is.
I agree.
He was not very convincing to me. Pennywise,
well, not
you really
just
need
that,
someone.
Their whole concept behind Pennywise, I think they were off.
Yeah, I think they were trying to go for like asexual in a way, because Tim Curry.
Well, not even just that. Go ahead and finish your idea.
Yeah, because for those who've read the novel, obviously it was female, but it took a male form because males were considered more aggressive and more frightening.
Well, it actually took many forms.
Yeah.
And Pennywise just happened to be its favorite. And in the book, as far as I remember, because you got to have to forgive me. I've not read the book in probably 30 years almost.
Yeah.
But from what I recall in the book, Pennywise isn't even in the book all that much. It takes all kinds of different forms.
Yeah. And there's a realization that by one of the victims, I think Bill's wife, where she gets caught by it and realizes, oh my God, it's female. And it's laid eggs, right. Which ends up being cut from the miniseries, I guess, because it wasn't considered relevant. And frankly, I was kind of disappointed in the decision by Stephen King to even give the creature a backstory, because the biggest thing about horror is that we're frightened most of what we don't know. Right. And if you explain the monster, you take away the mystery, and therefore you take away its ability to frighten you. So
to a point, but it also does connect with his overall bigger universe. So it's still, I get where you're coming from in that, but I guess I've always just kind of
he's trying to tie everything to his Dark Tower universe, which is understandable. That's his baby, but I just saw it for that specific story, and it's like, why would you?
Right. Well, and that's why the 90 miniseries works, though, because it does have more of an ambiguous background. It is just basically they broke it down to its core elements. Same thing with the kid's story, and that's why so far, until I see the second part, I can't say for sure, but so far I still like the 90 miniseries better.
Yeah, same
for
here.
Various reasons. And to go back to what we were saying before, as far as Pennywise goes, Tim Curry's version, he lured the kids in at first, especially the younger brother, who the name escapes me for some reason all of a sudden, Georgie, with being a nice, fun clown at first. Skarsgård's clown is creepy looking from the start. What kid is going to go near a clown like that? Because that's kind of the whole point, is first of all, it lures you in, and then he scares the shit out of you and feeds off your fear. And the more fearful you are, the stronger he becomes.
Yeah, akin to salting the meat, in King's own words. Yeah, so
right. Yeah. And see, that's the thing, is the book dives into all kinds of different stuff. And from what I remember, the book goes chapter by chapter, adults, kids, adults, kids, adults, kids. From what I recall, I could be wrong.
Yeah, I think
because that's why they did the miniseries that way too. Yeah, kind of.
Sort of. It's like that they put but the
latter half is
more in a
adults,
linear
yes.
narrative. So it goes from the kids, and then in the second half of the miniseries, it go to the adults and tell their story.
Well, right, because there's always something, if I remember right, in the book, there's always something that happens to where something triggers a memory, and you go, because like each chapter, I think, even follows each one of the characters for like the first however many chapters. I think it's one kid each chapter, because I think it first starts with, well, at first we don't even get to those kids until I think like chapter 3 or 4. But again, then just to reiterate, though, I think like what's the main character's name? Billy or
Bill.
Bill, yeah. I think Bill's first, and then down the line they go through each character for a chapter, and then like you said, then near the end, if I remember right, the story does get a little bit more linear in the book as well when they're adults. But like there's a lot of paralleling going back and forth in the first one, and that's one thing I missed in this new movie, because there was also points in the movie where in the new It, I know we're getting off on a tangent here on It, but
yeah, but it kind of comes back to the original theme here. It's because you've got the new movie and it's got this huge budget, relative to others. And so, like I said, there's a loss of creativity, and
there was
one of the side effects of that loss of creativity is casting someone who's not convincing as your monster, and it's like
right. And then the story suffered as well, because since they didn't have the back and forth, and there was a lot of moments that there was like in my review, I said this and I still stand by it. It's good, but it lacks a lot of setup and has a ton of payoffs, so the payoffs don't work. Unless you've read the book or seen the 90 miniseries, you don't understand some of the payoffs. And I ran into some people where I had to explain stuff to them. One example especially is the blood in Beverly's bathroom. In the book and in the miniseries, Beverly cleans it up several times before the boys help her clean it up. And the reason is every time she cleans it up, it comes back again. It only goes away when the boys help her clean it up.
Right. In other words, kind of use. Well, there's strength in numbers in a community,
exactly.
which is,
and that's where she figures that out. And they have that kind of moment in the new movie, but they don't use it to its full advantage. Same thing with, here's another thing. This is kind of just a nerd thing. This movie was made by Warner Brothers. At this time, Warner Brothers owns Jason, Freddy, and could surely get the rights to all these other characters. In the original book, there was the Mummy, Dracula, Frankenstein, I think, Wolfman, I know for sure. Like all the
and later you had the creature from Black Lagoon, but that was like in the 50s. But that was like 20 years after their best monster movies were kind of like done and over.
But the point is that they used the monsters of that era for their fears. Now they set it up like they had the Nightmare on Elm Street playing in the background in the theater and stuff like that. They set it up perfectly to have the modern horror characters in this. And it would have even been just a blast to see Robert Englund come back for a cameo as Freddy, even if it was just one part. You know what I mean? Yeah. But they could have utilized that. There was so much fun stuff that they seemed to like they avoided just because they didn't want to be compared to the miniseries, is what I was kind of getting to near the end here. But it's like that to me, it made the film a lot less impactful than the original miniseries was story-wise. And a lot of what came out of that film, Tommy Lee Wallace, I think, directed it. He had to improvise too because he had nothing for a budget, and they went from a 10-hour miniseries down to an 8-hour, down to a 3. I think it was the story. There was several other directors involved, in fact. So I mean, it's like the movie hardly. It just like this new one. It like took years and years and years to make, and then by the time they made it, I feel like all they did was screw any good chance they had of having something really good, because like the original miniseries is good, but now think about it, if like Tobe Hooper, I think even some of the other masters of horror that were involved with it originally, if they had gotten 10 hours to tell that miniseries, it'd have been amazing. If they would have filmed two movies back to back.
Tobe Hooper did Salem's Lot, and I didn't actually care for it because I read the book before watching the miniseries, and I always felt that he tried to insert he tried to make the vampire Barlow too much like Nosferatu, and then he didn't even give him any speaking parts, so James Mason's character. But there's a part in the book where, again, spoilers for people who haven't actually read it, and if you haven't, why not? It's been decades. But, Straker, who's like the manservant, he gets killed, and that kind of forces Barlow to go on the run, kind of like with Dracula. When he loses Renfield, when he loses access to his English holdings, he's forced to flee back home. And, that's the turning point in the novel Dracula, where, the good guys have him on the run and they're getting the upper hand. And, likewise in Salem's Lot. But in Tobe Hooper's, it's like, okay, but, you didn't really kind of follow the book. So, why do we believe that you can be defeated when you haven't actually really hurt him yet? It's kind of, so you're coming out of left field.
Well, it wasn't just him though. There was several other directors before Tommy Lee Wallace came on board. The point was though, is if they were able to let it breathe and have some faith in it, I think it would have been 10 times better. Same thing with the new one here, because at one point it was supposed to be 2 films back to back, like they were going to film at the same time. Then they changed their minds. That's why we're waiting for this next movie now, because they didn't know this was going to be as big of a hit as it was. They had no fucking clue. Which is beyond me, because the Stephen King miniseries from back in the day is one of the most memorable TV movies of the past 40 years, right along with like Roots, and it's definitely in that top 5, probably if not top 10, that people remember as big TV events. You know what I mean? It was. I remember it did just hellacious numbers, And I'm sure at that time they were, I think it was ABC. I think they were like, I'm sure they were like, oh, shit, we should have done this for a hell of a lot more nights.
Yeah.
And I'm sure Warner Brothers was thinking the same thing here. And honestly, I would have been happier if they'd have stretched it out into 3 movies, because there's more than enough stuff in that book to where you could have done 3 parts. You could have done, earlier part with the kids, mix in the middle, and then the adults at the end. If you had to do it linear, whatever. It's like you could have really made this a big event, and it could have been almost Oscar worthy horror film, but now we just got a cheap McDonaldized version of it, as far as I'm concerned.
And another thing I don't like in the modern version, because in the book and in the original miniseries, Mike, the black kid, is the one who tells the story. He's the one who he's the one who did all the history research on the town of Derry, Maine, and all the unexplained killings and the cycle and everything. And he's the one who calls everyone back together. But in the reboot, he's just a random kid who comes along and gets rescued.
Well, they gave Mike all his stuff, or they gave
no, Bill. No,
Bill.
wait, no,
Well,
not Bill.
the chubby kid.
Yeah, it's like the kid John Ritter played as an adult.
Mike's the black kid. Yeah. But no, yeah, and that's the thing, is they totally took away all his character and gave him this new backstory that I doubt is going to amount to shit in the next movie.
Yeah, and then they threw in this love triangle between Bill and Beverly and chubby kid, and I was like, yeah, that I don't remember that.
Yeah, that wasn't in the original either, I don't think. Not even in the book. I mean, they were, well, that's, she sleeps with all of them in the book.
Yeah, right.
I think she doesn't
and that's something that doesn't make it
like
into any screen adaptation for obvious reasons, because people are not comfortable with the idea of kids.
That's just Stephen King doing his thing. Stephen King would love to do that. He would take, if you read any of his books, there's always these what the fuck moments in every one of his books. Just about, you're going along, everything's, and then all of a sudden there's a wait, did I just read what I thought I read? Because he just has these weird moments and random characters out of nowhere sometimes that are just like,
in fact,
and character moments.
Yeah, in fact, actually, Stephen King had done a couple of sequels to Salem's Lot in short story form that made it into a Night Shift anthology, and in the second one, it tells, and the chronology is kind of messed up here because it's set 2 years after the events at Salem's Lot, but the narrator suggests that the vampires have been there for years before then, so it's kind of messed up chronologically. But long story short, there's this guy who comes in, and his family's stranded in this snowdrift that they found out they were passing through Salem's Lot, and so they rush to go and rescue the family because before the vampires get to them, and there's this creepy little girl, the guy's daughter, who got turned and asks one of the guys for a kiss, and Stephen King makes it creepy as he's wont to do, but you can't film something like that, though. You just can't. I mean, that's why they left it out of the 1990 miniseries and It. That's why they left it out of the new version from Warner Brothers. So I can kind of understand where they're coming from, but this brings us full circle to Hereditary because, again, this kind of breaks taboos on things that you just cannot show being done to kids. So and that's the only spoiler I'm going to give to people who haven't seen it.
Right. Well, and there's certain places you just can't go, and just because you have that, even if it's still acting and quote unquote fake, they will not allow you to show certain things with kids to this day, still by law, let alone just within rating systems. So, I mean, it's...
Yeah, so it's definitely taking some huge risks, but I think the payoff, though, it's interesting because Ari Aster actually, much like Ruin Johnson, set out to make a movie that would piss people off, and I guess he was kind of disappointed when at first people weren't expressing all that much outrage, and then it kind of built up, and then he was satisfied. But I think the difference, interestingly enough, is that whereas Ruin Johnson deliberately set out to insult fans, Aster is trying to piss people off by making them think about things in a way that they maybe were not comfortable thinking about before. And so it's really kind of more towards the idea of where he kind of respects the audience's intelligence, but he's still pissing you off deliberately because of the subject matter being what it is.
Right. There's a big difference there. I mean, and there's a difference also between doing it in a Star Wars film and an indie horror film. You
Yeah,
know,
and that I think is something Kathleen Kennedy doesn't understand is, it's like, look, Disney plopped down $4 billion for this. You want to please people. You don't want to piss them off, which is why she's out of a job, most likely, by the end of the year.
if she isn't already, but yeah, that's just it. It's like they haven't really denied it, but that's where we kind of come back to where I said before. If you're going to do a franchise like that, where you have very connected and intricate things going on with characters and storylines and things have to lead up to something, excuse me, you really need somebody there who's able to oversee everything, and Kathleen Kennedy should be that person. But unfortunately, she obviously allowed Rian Johnson to do just about anything he wanted with The Last Jedi, obviously, and that's where this whole mess kind of began, or at least we kind of seen that there was a problem.
Yeah,
because it was there. There was kernels of it before that when it came to the whole Gareth Edwards situation and the reshoots with Rogue One, and then turn around, we heard of Chris and Lord Miller getting fired, and that situation there, all that happening around the same. It was like this cumulative effect. Like, okay, something's not right here. And I was even willing to go as far as to defend her and saying maybe she's getting stuff forced upon her by Disney, but that doesn't seem to be the case. Yeah, because if she was able to allow Johnson just take the trilogy plan and go, no, I'm going to do this instead, and then him come out and basically call everybody man babies, and I did what I wanted to do, and basically admit that he made it a selfish fan film instead of actually making a Star Wars movie.
Yeah, and it's not even a good fan film. I've actually read good fan fiction, and for example, Highlander the series, when they had the season 5 cliffhanger ending, that because they weren't sure they were going to get a sixth season, so they ended it in a way that killed off a major cast member. But I read actually a piece of fan fiction that actually did a better job finishing up that storyline than what was actually shot for TV. So there is good fan fiction out there.
Yeah, but for like every one, though,
Johnson's fan fiction kind of reads like the stuff that a 12-year-old girl might write.
Exactly, or this stuff where where they have these fantasies of this character getting with that character for no apparent reason other than they want to see him. That's just it. It's a lot of personal bullshit.
Right, and
you got to be able to step aside from that and work within the confines of what is there. And that's again where this all thing comes back to the whole franchise system, and that's how it works.
And
it's
of
like
course you can't call Rey and Maure Sue, or you can't call Poe Gary Stu or whatever, because then people will call you a sexist. So it's like, no, there's nothing sexist about calling something a Mary Sue or a Gary Stu. It's
poor writing, and poor characterization, and I actually I don't really consider her a Mary Sue so much as even Daisy Ridley said, she didn't even know what her character was doing in The Last Jedi, because it was a completely different character from what she was before, like a complete 180.
Right.
And
well, even with Abrams,
90% of the cast, yeah.
Right. Well, even with Abrams, he makes her, into quite the Mary Sue, because she just starts using the Force like a Jedi Master.
Here's the thing:
without any apparent training. It's like
right. But in defense of that, I will say this, because there was a recent report. I can't remember if it was Simon Pegg or somebody else, but I know it was somebody who knew what the hell was going on, and they said basically that Rey did have a very important lineage. This story we got now she was not meant to be a nobody. So chances are there was a plan in place as to why she was this powerful, because we have a lot of moments where she's, oh, I have these powers. Oh, wow, I can do this. I mean, it's not like Luke. It was different.
And it could kind of be like, and it can kind of be like the Frankenstein's monster, where it's not things learned so much as things remembered. And
exactly. And I think it was Luke who dropped her off on that planet, to be honest with you, because he was separating all the younglings and
because you don't actually have to make her a Skywalker or a Solo, like maybe a student of Luke's. But
exactly
right. But and maybe he dropped her off because he was afraid of Kylo either turning her or.
Well, that was the whole thing. Is the way we were understood and the story was set up was that Kylo had either turned a bunch of Luke's students or got in with this cult-like group,
or rather Snoke had turned them, and he was afraid of.
Right. But I'm just saying, like, it was either his students were turned or killed, in return, because we see the temple and we see all the dead bodies and stuff here and there, and there's all this other stuff. So it leads you to believe that there was some kind of battle that ensued, and I'm sure the older Jedi were trying to fight them off, and they failed. And that's again where Luke felt like he failed, and all the other stuff on top of it. But then Johnson just threw all that shit out the window and did his own version.
Yeah,
I mean, I have a feeling 99% of what's in that movie was not in the plans at all.
Right.
Not at all.
Well, according to Johnson, 90% of what ultimately got shot was based on the first draft of, and it's like, you never shoot a movie from the first draft. That's not done in Hollywood. Not if you want to.
Especially considering he was writing that first draft after not even seeing the film. He read the script, but he had not seen the film yet.
Right. So, right. And if it sounds like we're getting off the rails, it's because we are. But it's
true, though. It all kind of comes around to the good storytelling, though, and it matters. You can't just go. Sometimes, you can get a good story on the first try, but Psycho is not the same story it was in the book. We've said that before, and that's what this kind of all harkens back to. Is Hitchcock knew that wasn't going to work on screen. Yeah,
and Peter Jackson actually, going back, I just started recently rereading The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and going back and looking at the first three Lord of the Rings films by Peter Jackson, I actually can understand now why he made so many of the changes he did with that first trilogy, because the book really, you can't shoot most of what's in there and make it watchable as a movie.
The book almost reads like instructions on how to make the movie.
Right.
It's weird. It's like very... I mean, it's a story.
Right. Well, there's a lot more talking and idleness in the books than there is in the movie, and there, a lot of stuff is reordered or not included, like the bit with Tom Bombadil and the
Right. He gave a lot of dialogue to other characters and amalgamized some characters, and you're going to do that sometimes, and I have no issues with that. Adaptation, and that kind of gets us back to, is a big difference between remake and adaptation. Now, to me, the new It is more of a remake of the 90 miniseries than it is a readaptation of It. And that's very important, because to me, it would have been much better for us to get an adaptation of the book more so than basically what we've already got.
Yeah, and that brings us back to John Carpenter, because his rendition of The Thing actually wasn't so much a remake of Howard Hawks' film. Right. Carpenter is a huge Howard Hawks fan, but the Thing was actually a readaptation of the novella Who Goes There.
Right, it went back to those elements, and it's you can even kind of say the same thing about The Fly. It doesn't there's nothing in the new movie in that new movie, in the 86 movie,
the 80s movie,
that resembles the 67, I think the original came out, or whatever it was, 69 maybe.
But I know it's either late 50s or early 60s. I know that much.
Yeah, but actually you're right, it might have been 59. No, it was like there's no resemblance in those films other than one thing, and that is a guy turns himself into a fly. That's it.
Pretty much, yeah. I mean,
it's
because
the original film is actually told in flashbacks. I mean, I'm sure a lot of our audience hasn't seen it, but they've seen the 86 Fly. No, like the original film is all told back in flashbacks, and he just kind of turns him half into a fly, not like a whole fly until near the end. But it was really just like you didn't have the whole transformation, as opposed to Cronenberg, right, who directed the 86 one. His whole thing was he took it from an angle of, at that time, AIDS was an epidemic and all this other stuff, and he poured that into it. Same thing with Scarface is another one. It doesn't resemble the original hardly, other than just in concept, and that's because they took what was relevant at the time and they poured it into. Tarantino's another one who does a lot of that with his films. He'll take stuff from old elements and pour his new flavor in there. And we were just talking about him last night because of the whole Star Trek thing and stuff like that, and I can't recall if you're much of a Tarantino fan. I don't think you are. But
well, I do like Tarantino films, but I don't think he's a good fit for Star Trek. And honestly, if he's going to continue in the Abrams continuity, I'm sorry, but I think too many people have wised up to how much of a fraud Abrams is as a storyteller, and they're not going to go for another one set in his universe. I think if you really have to if you're going to tell a Star Trek story, you really kind of have to go back to the original universe and the original concept. But even that's problematic because which of the original concept, because they've done the prequels to the original series to death. They've done it really kind of started in the 80s, but it got worse with from Next Generation onward on the big screen, turning it more into an action movie than it really should have been. Where the original Star Trek,
right?
It
well,
told
that comes
social
again
and
to
political
reaching more
tales.
demographics, yeah.
Right, and I actually think that the original Star Trek: The Motion Picture was probably the closest to Gene Roddenberry's original vision than any other iteration. Even,
Probably, yeah.
Even the Spock trilogy from like 2 through 4 kind of missed the mark, and I think
there's that other one though, the one with another one that most people don't like. Ironically, I
Star
believe,
Trek 5,
is
I think.
the fifth one.
Yeah,
I think that isn't that based on one of their scripts that was meant for a show too?
Yeah, and actually, I kind of have to give William Shatner credit for trying to recapture what made the original Star Trek work. I just think the studio kind of screwed him over because they gave him like a fraction of the budget that they gave Leonard Nimoy for his 2 outings. ILM was not available at that time because they were working on something else, so they stuck him with a company that really, I guess, wasn't up to par. And so all sorts of production problems that I think were not really Shatner's fault. And then of course they released it to compete against Batman and Indiana Jones and Ghostbusters 2, and so that whole movie was doomed from the start.
Oh, yeah.
But watching it, obviously it's not as good as a lot of the other films,
really,
but you can see the bones of a good story there.
But it shouldn't have been, though. That's the sad part. Even though what you brought out is what I really think what killed it was the summer of. That was 89, and it was like one of the biggest summers other than probably 84.
Yeah.
In the 80s. And that movie just got buried, I think, more than anything, because it came off of Part 4, which, if I remember right, at that time was the highest grossing and best reviewed. And people who'd never seen a Star Trek show before seen Star Trek 4.
Yeah.
Everybody was watching that movie. So, it was, I think, like you said, I think it was more just the saturation at the time, but then people realized it wasn't that good. But it's ironic, like you said, that the 2 movies that are the closest to Star Trek in its, purity are the ones that are considered the least favorite by, the grand masses. And I think that speaks to the fact of, doing a movie like that on a grand scale is a different animal in a way. And they knew that at the time, and whether or not it was the right idea to dumb things down a little bit and add a little more action, whether or not that's the right thing to do or not, I don't know. But you look at movies like, there's different kinds of episodes of Star Trek, so they should have been able to do different kinds of movies. But I think Wrath of Khan really kind of set the template from there on out. And despite how great Wrath of Khan is, even as a Star Trek movie, I think that was kind of what it was like one of the worst things that could have happened to Star Trek, because from that moment on, every movie after that was trying to be Wrath of Khan, except for maybe Star Trek 4. And that's just because Leonard Nimoy's like, you know what, we're going to make a comedy. Fuck it. Sorry, I don't mean, sorry.
Yeah, well, no, no, I don't care if you swear. But yeah, and then of course Star Trek 6, Nicholas Meyer comes back and he tells another movie that's more action and also kind of thriller. But and he had the talent to pull it off. But yeah, when you go into like Next Generation, then they start
right. Part 6 does have a very Manchurian Candidate kind of feeling to it, and again, that's another one that was a little different. I think it was more well received later on than it was in theaters at the time, though. Yeah. Yeah, and yes, but yeah, we've kind of gotten off at the rails because this was supposed to be at horror, and we've gotten off to other topics. But these franchises all work. That's the whole thing, though. Is like if you're going to do a horror franchise, that's one thing. But if you're doing a movie like Hereditary, yeah, you want to kind of stick to that Hitchcockian Psycho kind of pattern, to where it's like, you don't have to have $1 billion to make a great movie.
No, you don't. Yeah, and
look at Psycho. It could have been made in color. It could have been, that was the thing. If I remember right, correct me if I'm wrong if you know better, but if I remember right, Universal wanted to give Hitchcock like a couple $1 million to make it. And he's like, no, I don't want all that money. I just want to make it on this little itty bitty budget. It's going to be black and white. And, it's like they kept trying to force this money on him, and he made it completely outside of the studio, almost on his own, just so he could do what he wanted to do. And then delivered it to the studio, and they're like, oh, this is shit. They didn't like it, but then turned around. It was like their biggest hit, I think, for years and years. Yeah, up until probably one of the next movies, I think. But yeah, and it was interesting because Psycho was really kind of Hitchcock's joke, played on himself, and because his reputation at the time was for doing thrillers and
kind of dramas like that. And
Oh yeah.
so it was kind of like the joke was as much as on himself and his own reputation as it was on the audience, because that was
Well, he was one of those that was notorious, like
yeah, and that's how you subvert expectations, though. I mean, it's like,
right.
Oh, you thought
and
I was going to do
those,
this.
I can't think of the guy's name, can't think of his name, but these other guys where like they would do the shocker and all that kind of stuff, where you'd go to the theater and they'd have a buzzer under your seat, and
Yeah.
Matinee made fun of it, or was like a homage to is it Howard Castle, as I'm thinking of?
William Castle.
Or William Castle, thank you. So yeah, you had all these kind of guys like them that was a gimmicky thing. Hitchcock was like the, if like William Castle was like the dime store version of Hitchcock in a way, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
like he knew
Hitchcock,
how to.
Like I said, Hitchcock, much like Wes Craven, 20 years later, he was a master at understanding the psychology of his audience. And I have to wonder, some of the better horror writers, I think, are the ones who probably have a degree in psychology, because they know more about the human mind and how it works, and how best to screw with it so that you are put off balance, and then that gives the opportunity to really frighten you. And I think that's one of the reasons why The Wicker Man works so well, because that is pure psychological horror. It's not so much a mystery or even a thriller. That the horror comes at the end of the film when you realize what's really going on, and who the real victim here is. And that's how you do horror. Also, Werner Herzog's remake of Nosferatu, that was more psychological horror than it was anything else. And so I think if we're gonna have a horror renaissance again, I think you really kind of need to go back to basics and really kind of make films with the understanding, look, you have to have film theory, you have to have your film history, and really kind of understand what's been done before and how it's been done so well, and that it's still this popular to the point where people rehash it in new and different ways, and to the point where you've got two iconic horror film writers and directors suing each other in court just to claim credit for this interpretation of something that Alfred Hitchcock had done before. So I think if people really get their act together in Hollywood, and I hope it's sooner rather than later, we could see a resurgence. And like you, I hope Halloween helps relaunch that. But if they decide no, we're just going to go for what works, because I think the biggest problem with the media consolidation getting more and more pronounced is that people are willing to take fewer and fewer risks, and so in the quest to play it safe, creativity gets lost. And I think if something's not done soon, we're going to reach a point where it's like all the gimmicks in the world are not going to save your project at all. So yeah, I'm really kind of like cautiously optimistic for Halloween, and I still have hope with more independent projects like Hereditary. But if something doesn't happen soon with the major studios, I don't know what's going to happen, because Universal's Dark Universe is dead in the water at this point.
Which is sad, because they started the whole kind of thing when it comes to just horror in general, as far as horror films, and not only that, but having crossover universes and like a franchise, basically.
Yeah, and if you want to talk about psychological horror, The Wolfman actually is another.
Yeah.
In fact, I'd actually started a paper on this that I stopped in the middle of it, and actually I should probably get back to writing it. But The Wolfman actually, people kind of mistake what that movie was about. It wasn't about a guy who turns into a werewolf. It's about a guy who thinks he turns into a werewolf. Because because you get even right in the very beginning where it opens up that book and shows you the passage, it describes lycanthropy as a mental condition. So what happens with Larry Talbot, he's more a victim of cultural superstition and personal trauma that kind of combines to drive him over the edge. But people don't realize, and then of course it didn't help that Universal, when they brought him back later for Frankenstein Meets a Wolfman, decided, well, okay, so we're going to make it so he really was a werewolf after all, and then they just kept going with it for better or for worse.
Right. Well, and at that point, it becomes this whole other thing. And that's what I'm saying. With this dark universe, they went about it the whole wrong way. Even worse than DC did with theirs. because
the Benicio del Toro vehicle really didn't work all that well. I mean, it
no,
tried.
I don't think that was.
It tried to go with the whole cycle of abuse theory. It's like passing from the father to the son and everything. So I give him credit for trying, but the execution was just so bad.
Yeah, I wasn't a fan of that. And then I know they tried this earlier with the Dracula, a version of Dracula here a few years back, was originally supposed to kickstart this dark universe.
Francis Ford Coppola.
No. This was like
90s.
Just recently.
Oh, really? Okay.
No, this was like they were trying to do this. I can't remember who was. What was it? What's his face? Who was in the Hobbit movies? I can't think of his name now. Oh.
If you're talking about Martin Freeman or.
No, he played Bard.
Okay, I haven't seen the second two Hobbit movies. I saw the first one.
Okay, I can't think of his damn name right now. But anyway, it's on the tip of my tongue, and I think he played Dracula in it. And they tried it, and it didn't work. It flopped at the box office. So then they tried again with this Mummy, and that was where they made another mistake. Was bringing Tom Cruise in, letting Tom Cruise do his thing. Because I'm even going to stick up for Kurtzman here a little bit, because from what I've heard, Tom Cruise was all over that thing, and that's why it is the way it is.
Yeah.
So that doesn't surprise me at all.
Yeah, it's like, Tom Cruise, right. Well, Tom Cruise did the same thing with the Interview with the Vampire. He insisted on having everything. In fact, he actually, I think, used some kind of legal part of his contract to really kind of force Anne Rice to, give him glowing praise about his performance, when in fact, it's just Tom Cruise being Tom Cruise. It's like anyone could have.
Right, and that's basically what everybody. I have not seen it yet, and all the reviews I've read and whatever. So it's just basically another Tom Cruise movie. And that's just it. First of all, you have to find a common connection with all these monsters, and that's usually how they use like Van Helsing or somebody like that, like they did with the Van Helsing movie years back and stuff like that. I didn't like that movie, but I like the concept of the idea of, okay, you have this monster hunter. He's your central character. Well, then on the other end, you do basically what Marvel did, but you do it in reverse. Because, basically your horror monsters are your villains. You can't turn them into heroes. It's not going to work. They already have that. It was called, League of Extraordinary Gentlemen or whatever.
Right, and then basically, also Disney has been getting in on that with its reimaginings. Because I saw there was Maleficent. I was taking a scene that in the theaters by one of my relatives, and it's like, kind of no. Sorry, it doesn't work for me.
Right, but yeah, basically what they should have done is, set these all up. Like I said, you have a main protagonist who goes through as your Van Helsing character, and you set up your Dracula, your Frankenstein, and so on down the line. Then you have your movies where they cross over, just like they did back in the day. They've already done it. The map's there. Same thing with, that's why I think the King Kong Godzilla universe is going to work out all right, because they're basically using the same map they already had before.
I know Gareth Edwards. I didn't care for his take on.
I didn't care for that movie so much, but Kong did good enough.
Because a 2-hour movie and Godzilla's in it for like maybe 5 minutes. Once you reveal your monster, you're obligated to show it as much as possible. And they revealed him too early. It was more about the other monsters than it was about actual Godzilla. And it's like I thought Shin Godzilla was actually a much more frightening interpretation of the Godzilla mythos there, because that's what happens actually. If you want to talk about like rebooting a franchise, Shin Godzilla is how you do it. Because
I don't disagree there, but the Americanized, McDonaldized version that they need, the Gareth Edwards was, but Kong Skull Island worked, and as long as they don't hide Godzilla in Godzilla 2, King Kong versus Godzilla is going to do well. Unless it sucks, it's going to do well.
Yeah.
So
I think Godzilla 2 should have Godzilla in it. Basically, yeah. That's make that, because if you don't, if they do it, again like Gareth Edwards did with the first one, it's like, guys, leave it to Toho, please. If you're gonna screw it up this badly, leave it to Toho. They do it a lot better than you did, because Shin Godzilla was the bomb. But just kind of wrapping up, because we're going close to an hour and a half here. But one last thing I wanted to point out is an example of what happens when you give a film too much money. Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula. Because that one just went so over the top with the sex.
That was, it was.
And it's like, guys, look, this is what happens when you get too much money to do a film. And this was back in the early 90s.
Right.
So and it's like people don't learn lessons.
I want to say that's probably one of the last times I think they gave. Well, they've given him money since then, but they haven't given him as much freedom since then. I don't think, but yeah, I mean, for overall, I think it did okay in the box office, and I think it won some Oscars for some of the, or at least got nominated anyway for some of the makeup and all that kind of stuff. But
yeah, and I thought Wolf with Jack Nicholson. I mean, and that was directed by Mike Nichols, who also directed The Birdcage and other comedies. But that one was something that suffered the reverse problem. It had an appropriate budget to its size and scale, but the story itself, I think, kind of suffered because,
right.
And again, there were the bones of a good story there, but I think Nichols really was not given all that much to work with. I suspect also he didn't have really creative control or final cut because, like I said, I mean, there was the potential there, but it just didn't work.
See, because at that time, Nicholson was, I mean, he still is, but he was very, very, very powerful then. So I can imagine more so it was a vehicle built around him.
Yeah,
and maybe it wasn't built well enough. Maybe he could have used a couple more.
Yeah, because you got to pay Nicholson his salary because you got to pay him enough to get him off the toilet, basically. You know, because otherwise he'll just sit there until he gathers cobwebs.
Right. Well, he made more money off of Batman than anybody because he's not dumb.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
I mean, that's one thing, Jack, you can't say, and that's why he's been able to be so choosy in the last 20 years. Is he's not dumb. He knew what he was doing.
Right. Well, they actually used Robin Williams to kind of threaten, like, you know, Jack, we're going to give the Joker to Robin Williams. If you can't give the Joker to Robin Williams, he'll make it a complete. I'll take the damn script. You just go ahead and.
They used him just to get, and that's the thing. That's why Robin Williams, I think, said he'd never make a movie for Warner Brothers again, because not only did they fuck him over the first time by they were never had a plan on hiring him to play the Joker. They were going after Jack hard, but Jack was playing hardball. So they're like, all right, well, that's why we're going to say we're going to give it to Robin Williams and we'll get Jack on board then.
Yeah,
then
I think the tabloids were floating Robin Williams as Forever. Yeah, I think the tabloids were floating Robin Williams as the Riddler, but at that point he was like, no, not doing it.
Well, yeah, what happened was they used him again to get Jim Carrey. Same scenario, and at that point, that's where he said, I will never work for Warner Brothers again, because not only did they lie to me the first time, then they used me again the same way the second time, basically. And it was like, I totally agree with him on that aspect. It was like, you don't do that.
Disney pulled the same thing with Aladdin, where it's like, look, don't tell people I'm doing the genie's voice because I want them to be surprised, and they go ahead and blather it all over.
Well, that wasn't even what bothered him more so was that he said he went to a Toys R Us and he picked up a genie doll and it was his voice. And he wasn't getting any money for that on top of other things. And they were making all kinds of money out of the fact that it was like you said, Robin Williams in this movie. So he wasn't in the second film because they couldn't work out a deal until the third film, where he got paid a buttload of money for a straight-to-video animated film.
Yeah,
basically.
They really had to kiss ass for him to get him to come back for that, which, you know, but yeah. So we've really
way off track.
We keep going off track. I think we've kind of exhausted the original subject that I meant to come back to, which is why we keep digressing. But so that's pretty much our cue to give a good night. So anyway, those are our thoughts on the subject, one of several that we've covered tonight. So what do you think? Let us know in the comments. If you like what you've heard here, if you want to help us improve the webcast, please consider becoming a patron by clicking on the link to my Patreon page below and subscribing. And also, you know, subscribe to the YouTube channel and hit the bell icon to receive notifications whenever we upload content. So anyway, that's it for tonight. This is Michael Wilk and Tom Connors.
Thank you for having me once again.
Yeah, signing off, saying take care, good night, and we are out.